Learning can be described as a relatively lasting change in behavior that's the result of experience. It's the acquisition of information, knowledge, and skills. When you think of learning, it's easy to focus on formal education that takes place during childhood and adulthood. But learning is an ongoing process that takes place throughout life and isn't confined to the classroom. In this video, you'll learn about some key learning concepts in psychology, including behaviorism, behavior analysis, and associative learning. You'll also learn about the differences between instincts, reflexes, and learning. Behaviorism is a school of thought based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning, and conditioning occurs through interaction with the environment. Behaviorists believe that our actions are shaped by environmental stimuli. According to this school of thought, also known as behavioral psychology, behavior can be studied in a systematic and observable manner regardless of internal mental states. Behavioral theory also says that only observable behavior should be studied, as cognitions, emotions, and mood are far too subjective. Strict behaviorists believe that any person, regardless of genetic background, personality traits, and internal thoughts, can be trained to perform any task within the limits of their physical capabilities. It only requires the right conditioning. Behaviorism was formally established with the 1913 publication of John B. Watson's classic paper, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. It's best summed up by the following quote from Watson, who is often considered the father of behaviorism. Ask yourself as I read this quote what you think about this. He writes, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, or vocations." Simply put, strict behaviorists believe that all behaviors are the result of experience. Any person, regardless of their background, can be trained to act in a particular manner given the right conditioning. An image of Watson can be found on the lower left corner of the screen. In the upper right-hand corner, we see Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov is known for his research on the digestive system of dogs, which then led to his interest in natural processes like salivation. But then, this further led to his interest in salivation occurring when something in the environment, like a bell, was sounded. So there was a learned behavior that he became interested in. I'll cover classical conditioning in depth in a future video. In the lower right-hand corner of the screen is B.F. Skinner. He's known for his research with pigeons, where he was able to shape their behavior using reinforcement and different schedules of reinforcement. We'll look at Skinner and operant conditioning in detail in a later video. As humans, we pride ourselves on our ability to learn. However, it's not just humans that learn. It's all animals across the animal kingdom and insects as well. When we think about learning, learning is important as it enables us to survive. It allows us to adapt to our environment. It allows us to make choices that are based on consequences and that are based upon what we've observed other people doing as we try to be our own unique best. So when we think about learning, there are different theories of learning that are aligned with different approaches to how we think about human behavior. We have behavioral approaches. We have cognitive approaches. We have social approaches, just to name a few. Now, you'll notice in this image, these are loggerhead sea turtle hatchlings that are born knowing how to find the ocean and how to swim. Humans are not born with such complex abilities, but we are born with some reflexive responses. And then eventually, those reflexive responses are taken over by learning as we begin to experience our environment. So think about, for example, a baby who, if you were to hold that baby up when they're just very, very young and you hold them up in the air, you'll notice that their feet might move as though they're trying to walk. And when babies are in water, they'll make movements of their arms as though they're trying to swim. When babies are being held by their mother and against their mother's breast. They make a sucking movement. They move towards the mother as well. All of these are instinctive and reflexive behaviors that we have. We're biologically wired to engage in these behaviors. So this is different from learning. As we have more experiences, our brain then relies less on these automatic responses and then adapts to the environment. So let's take a look at how we would define or describe learning. I think it's important for us to note that learning overall, regardless of the approach that we take, can be considered to be a relatively permanent change in behavior potential that occurs as a result of experience. So whether we're talking about behaviorism, social perspective, whether we're talking about cognitive perspective, if we're talking about humanism or the humanistic perspective, or any of the other perspectives, what we're really looking at is that relatively permanent change in behavior. And it occurs as a result of experience. So we're going to be looking at some major theories or approaches to thinking about learning as we review this chapter. One term that you'll come across in your textbook is that of unlearned behaviors. Often when we think of unlearned, we think it means that something was learned and then we unlearned it, like you did something and then you undid that. Well, in the case of learning theory in psychology, unlearned means it was never learned, that it's natural and it's just a biological, natural response to a stimulus. So we have some important concepts here. We have instincts and reflexes. Instincts and reflexes are innate behaviors that an organism is born with, and they help organisms adapt to the environment. Reflexes specifically are motor neural reactions to a specific stimulus. They're more simple than instincts. They involve the activity of specific body parts. So as I gave as an example a moment ago, we have a sucking reflex. We also have other behaviors that are reflexive. For example, if you were to take the bottom of a baby's foot and you were to touch the bottom of it with your finger, you'll see that that baby's feet will fan out. I also mentioned the swimming movement, that babies will do that, and the walking movement. Those are just a few. We'll be exploring those later when we look at developmental psychology in the next unit. But these are very basic, simple behaviors that we engage in. And then we have what are called instincts, and these are behaviors triggered by a broader range of events. And so they involve the organism as a whole. So think about, for example, birds. Birds migrate to different parts of the United States during different seasons. So as the weather gets cold in the north, they migrate to the south. This is a very complex activity. The animal is not just simply reacting in response and has just one area one area of the brain of the brain involved. But what happens is we see here that there is complex activity in the brain that is resulting in this complex behavior. There are other ones as well. There is a very famous researcher, his name was Konrad Lorenz, and what he noticed is that little ducklings, when they would hatch from their eggs, that they would begin during a period soon after their birth, they would begin to follow the first moving object. And so normally what's around the baby bird is its mother, and so it would follow the mother. But Konrad Lorenz found that if he was around during a certain period soon after the baby bird had hatched, that the baby bird would follow him. And it was imprinting, in other words, on Konrad Lorenz, as though Konrad Lorenz was its mother. He also found that if he took a ball, like a red ball, and he put that around that baby bird around that certain period of time, soon after the baby was born, if he moved that red ball in front of that baby bird, it would begin to follow that bird as it would if the bird was its mother. So this is a much more complex behavior. So we have reflexes that are simple and they involve specific body parts, and they involve primitive centers of the central nervous system. And then we have instincts that are more complex and that involve higher brain centers. As I mentioned a moment ago, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that results from experience. And we use the phrase relatively permanent because just because you've learned something doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to always be present and always be present in your mind and affect your behaviors. And we might forget what we've learned. And I think when we think about learning, we need to think about it as not only a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that occurs from experience, but we want to think about it as a relatively permanent change in behavior potentiality. That's probably an important term we could put in here, because potential means you may engage in what you've learned or you may not. Just because we've learned something, that doesn't mean that we are going to actually do that thing. So we might put the phrase potentiality in here if we wanted to expand our thinking about this phrase. So it involves acquiring skills and knowledge through experience, and it also involves conscious and unconscious processes, which you learned about in earlier chapters. What we're going to be looking at is something called associative learning, and this is when an organism makes connections between stimuli or events that occur together in the environment. And there are many approaches to learning that we'll be looking at, and they are that are part of behaviorism. We're going to be looking at classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and in particular, here we see associative learning. In classical conditioning, you'll see how we make associations between something in the environment and something that naturally causes a response. And so we make these associations. And then here with operant conditioning, we begin to learn that certain behaviors result in certain consequences. So there's an association. So here we have in this image, a response for this dog is associated with a consequence. The dog has learned that certain behaviors result in receiving a treat. So the dog has made this association. In this video, you've learned about behaviorism, behavior analysis, instincts, reflexes, how learning is defined, and you learned about some of the basics of associative learning. In the next video, you'll learn about classical conditioning. If you like this video, you'll find more videos like this one on the Psychology Lab channel.